Welcome to History at Bedtime. Tonight, we begin a quiet journey through ancient Egypt. Tonight, we are not going to rush through dates, dynasties, and museum labels. We are going to move slowly, the way the Nile moves through the desert, carrying silt, memory, and life along its banks. We are going to follow one of the longest stories human beings have ever lived. A civilization that began with small farming villages beside a river, became a kingdom of pyramids and temples, survived invasions and civil wars, spoke to its gods in carved stone, and finally passed into the hands of Greeks, Romans, Christians, and Arabs, while still leaving something of itself behind. Wherever you are now, let the day soften around you. You do not need to study or remember every name. Some parts may stay clearly in your mind, like a pyramid against a bright sky. Others may drift past quietly, like reeds moving along the riverbank. That is all right. The past does not demand anything from you tonight. It only opens a door. Ancient Egypt is often shown as a place of gold masks, royal tombs, curses, and impossible monuments. But before it was any of those things, it was a human world. Farmers watching the flood, children chasing birds from the fields, women grinding grain before sunrise, scribes sharpening reed pens, priests washing statues in dim temples, and old people watching the river run north. The Egyptians lived with a feeling for time that is difficult to imagine. Their civilization lasted for more than 3,000 years, and its language continued in new forms long after the old gods were fading. The Great Pyramid was already ancient when Cleopatra walked the halls of Alexandria. Cleopatra herself lived closer to us than to the builders of that pyramid. To speak of Egypt is not to speak of one moment, but of many Egypts layered together. So let us begin gently, not with a king, not with a battle, and not with a tomb, but with the river that made all of it possible. Egypt owes everything to a river. The Nile is not simply a feature of the landscape. It is the reason Egypt exists at all. Without it, the land on either side would be nothing but pale desert stretching from horizon to horizon, as dry and lifeless as the surface of the moon. But the Nile carries water from deep within the African continent, flowing north through thousands of miles before it spreads into a delta and meets the Mediterranean Sea. Every year, for thousands of years before any dam controlled its flow, the river flooded. And when it receded, it left behind a layer of rich, dark silt, some of the most fertile soil on earth. The Egyptians called this dark earth Kemet, the Black Land. They called the desert Deshret, the Red Land. And the difference between the two was the difference between life and death. Everything that Egypt became grew from that narrow strip of black along the river's edge. Before Egypt had pharaohs, before it had pyramids, before anyone carved a royal name into stone, the Nile Valley was a place where people learned to live with a difficult kind of abundance. The river gave life, but the desert stood close on either side, reminding everyone that life depended on balance. Too little flood meant famine. Too much flood could wash away homes, boundaries, and storehouses. The earliest communities along the Nile had to learn patience, timing, cooperation, and memory. They watched the rise and fall of water year after year, and gradually those observations became habits, and those habits became institutions. Long before the first dynasty, people lived in villages along the river and in the desert margins that were greener than they are today. They buried their dead with pottery, tools, ornaments, and sometimes food, suggesting that even in these early centuries, death was not seen as a simple disappearance. They made combs and pallets, carved animal shapes, and decorated pottery with boats, birds, and flowing lines. These early objects are quiet, but they matter. They show that the Egyptian imagination did not suddenly appear with kingship. It grew slowly from village life, from seasonal rhythms, from the experience of living between water and sand. As the climate of North Africa became drier, the Nile became even more important. People moved closer to the river. Communities grew larger. Local chiefs gained influence. Trade routes carried stone, shells, copper, oils, and ideas. Symbols of power began to appear. Ceremonial maces, decorated palettes, special tombs, and the first marks that would eventually develop into writing. The land that later Egyptians called Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the northern delta were not simply directions on a map. They were distinct regions with their own landscapes, resources, and political centers. The south was narrower, more river-bound, with desert cliffs pressing in. The north opened into the rich maze of the delta, where the Nile divided into branches before reaching the sea. The unification of these regions became the founding memory of Egyptian kingship. Later tradition associated it with a ruler called Menes, while archaeology points us toward early kings such as Narmer, whose famous palette shows a king wearing the crown of Upper Egypt on one side and symbols associated with Lower Egypt on the other. Whether one man truly unified the country in a single dramatic act, or whether the process was longer and more complicated, the idea became central. Egypt imagined itself as the two lands, north and south, river and delta, papyrus and lotus, joined under one ruler. That union was not merely political, it was cosmic. The king was the person who held opposites together. This is one of the first deep patterns of Egyptian history. Unity was always precious, because disunity was always possible. When the country was strong, later Egyptians described it as a time when Ma'at prevailed, when order held. When the country broke apart, they described it in images of hunger, violence, and confusion. The memory of unification gave every later pharaoh a task larger than administration. He, and in rare cases she, had to keep the two lands joined. The crowns, the rituals, the royal titles, the carved scenes of enemies defeated and offerings presented to gods all returned to this same idea. Egypt was not just ruled, it had to be renewed. The earliest kings chose places of symbolic importance for their burials. At Abydos, in Upper Egypt, some of the first royal tombs were dug into the desert, surrounded by subsidiary burials, grave goods, and signs of growing royal authority. Abydos became one of the holiest places in Egypt, later associated with Osiris, the murdered and resurrected god of the dead. It is moving to think that a place connected with the very beginning of kingship later became a place where Egyptians went to think about death, renewal, and eternity. In Egypt, beginnings and endings had a way of folding into one another. The creation of the Egyptian state required more than a crown. It required administrators, tax collectors, granaries, scribes, boats, storehouses, and a shared language of power. Grain had to be measured and stored. Labor had to be organized. Fields had to be counted after floods. Offerings had to be delivered to temples and tombs. Writing grew partly from this practical need to remember who owed what, where something had been stored, and which official had received it. But in Egypt, practical things rarely remained merely practical. Writing became sacred. Kingship became divine. Storehouses became part of the machinery of cosmic order. In these earliest centuries, the form of Egypt was already taking shape. A narrow green world beside a river. A desert that preserved the dead. A ruler who embodied unity. A bureaucracy that measured and recorded. A religion that saw the divine in animals, stars, water, stone, and royal power. By the time the first pyramids rose, Egypt was not an experiment anymore. It was a civilization with a memory of itself. The Nile floods were so regular, so dependable, that the Egyptians built their entire calendar around them. The year was divided into 3 seasons. Akhe, the time of inundation when the waters rose. Parat, the time of growing when seeds were planted in the wet soil. And Shimu, the the time of harvest when the crops were gathered before the heat returned. These seasons shaped every aspect of life: when farmers worked, when festivals were held, when taxes were collected, when construction projects began. The rhythm of the river was the rhythm of Egyptian civilization itself. To live in Egypt was to live in harmony with the Nile, and those who forgot that lesson quickly learned why it mattered. The ancient Egyptians had a name for themselves and for their country that carried deep meaning. They called their land Tameri, the beloved land. There is something quietly moving about that. Of all the words they might have chosen, they settled on beloved. This was not simply geography to them. It was home in the deepest possible sense, a place charged with meaning, watched over by gods, and worth preserving across generations. When scribes wrote about Egypt, they wrote about it the way one might write about a cherished person, with reverence, with care, and with the implicit understanding that the land itself was alive. Egyptian society was arranged in a careful order, with the pharaoh at the top. But most of the population was composed of farmers, ordinary men and women who tended fields, raised animals, and fed the civilization. These were not slaves. Archaeologists and historians have worked carefully to understand who built Egypt's monuments, and the evidence increasingly points to a workforce of skilled laborers, seasonal workers, and craftsmen who were fed, housed, and treated as important contributors to great national projects. The image of Egypt as a civilization built entirely on the backs of enslaved people has been significantly revised by modern scholarship. What the evidence shows instead is a complex society where ordinary people had rights, where workers could file complaints, where women could own property, and where life, though hard, had structure and dignity. The Nile was home to an extraordinary variety of wildlife, and the Egyptians lived alongside it in ways that shaped their beliefs, their diet, and their art. Crocodiles rested on muddy banks. Hippos wallowed in shallow water. Ibises picked their careful way through the shallows. Falcons turned slow circles in the blue above the fields. Cats prowled granaries in search of mice. All of these creatures found their way into Egyptian religion and art, becoming symbols, becoming gods, becoming the quiet vocabulary of a civilization that paid close attention to the natural world. The Egyptians did not see a hard line between the human world and the animal world. They saw continuity. They saw the divine expressing itself through every living thing. In the early morning, before the heat of the day took hold, the villages along the Nile would have been alive with quiet activity. Women carried water jars from the river. Bakers lit their ovens. Children drove goats toward the edge of the fields. Farmers shouldered their tools and walked out into the cool air of dawn, their sandaled feet pressing into earth still damp from the night. The sounds would have been familiar: the lowing of cattle, the splash of water against a clay bank, the low murmur of conversation between neighbors, the distant call of a bird. It is a scene that feels very far from us now, and yet in all the ways that matter most, it is recognizable. People going about their morning, trying to make the day good. Egyptian homes were built primarily from mud brick, a practical, abundant material made by mixing Nile mud with straw, shaping it into blocks, and leaving it to dry in the sun. Mud brick is an excellent building material in a dry climate. It is cool in summer and warm in winter, and it requires no firing in a kiln. Homes were simple, but not sparse. Most had a main room for daily life, a sleeping area, a storage room, and a small courtyard. Wealthier homes had more rooms, painted walls, and gardens with shading trees. Even in modest homes, there were small household shrines where the family could place offerings to protective deities, a patron goddess of childbirth, a god who watched over the threshold, the spirits of beloved ancestors. Faith was not something Egyptians went out to find. It lived inside the walls of home. The ancient Egyptians loved color. Their art, their jewelry, their clothing, their painted walls. All of it demonstrates a culture that found deep pleasure in vivid hues. The pigments they used were made from natural materials: ground malachite for green, crushed lapis lazuli for blue, red and yellow ochre from iron-rich earth, carbon black from charcoal, and pure white from ground limestone. These colors carried meaning beyond beauty. Green represented fertility and new life. White represented purity. Red could mean power or danger depending on context. Blue was associated with the heavens, with water, with the divine. When an Egyptian artist painted a wall or decorated a coffin, every color was a choice weighted with significance. Bread was the foundation of the Egyptian diet, and the variety of breads produced was remarkable. Archaeologists have found evidence of more than 30 different types of bread in ancient Egypt, made from emmer wheat and barley, shaped into rounds and cones and long loaves, plain or enriched with honey, dates, or spices. Bread was so central to Egyptian life that it served as currency for workers, as an offering to gods, and as a staple in the diet of everyone from the humblest farmer to the pharaoh himself. The work of grinding grain was done primarily by women, using stone grinding tools that required significant physical effort. Some mummies show where patterns on the joints and spine consistent with years of this labor, a quiet testimony written into bone. Beer was, alongside bread, one of the most important foods in ancient Egypt, and it was very different from modern beer. Egyptian beer was thick, nutritious, and relatively low in alcohol. It was made from fermented bread soaked in water, strained through a basket, and sometimes flavored with dates or other sweeteners. It was consumed by everyone, men, women, children, as a daily food source rather than primarily as an intoxicant. Workers on building projects received beer as part of their daily rations. It was included in tomb offerings to sustain the dead in the afterlife. Recipes for beer appear among the oldest written texts in Egyptian history. To understand Egypt, you have to understand that beer was not a luxury. It was a staple as essential as the bread it was made from. The Nile provided not only water but also food of extraordinary abundance. Egyptians fished the river with hooks, nets, and wicker traps. They hunted waterfowl in the marshes using throwing sticks and trained animals. They gathered lotus flowers and papyrus reeds from the water's edge. The marshes were not simply wild places. They were productive landscapes that Egyptians managed, harvested, and celebrated. Painted scenes from tombs often show families in small papyrus boats, poling through dense reed beds while herons stand nearby and fish dart through the clear water below. These scenes were not only representations of daily activity, they were also expressions of an ideal: abundance, peace, family, and a world in its proper order. Linen was the primary textile of ancient Egypt, and the quality that Egyptian weavers achieved was extraordinary. The finest linen was so thin that it was sometimes described as woven air. It was bleached white and worn draped and folded in ways that changed across different periods of Egyptian history. In the heat, loose linen was cool and comfortable. It was also easily washed, which mattered in a culture that placed great importance on cleanliness. Priests were required to shave their bodies and bathe several times a day. Ordinary Egyptians also bathed regularly, using a paste made from ash and clay that served as a kind of soap. Cleanliness was not merely a personal preference in Egypt. It had religious and moral dimensions. To be clean was to be prepared to stand in the presence of the divine. Personal appearance mattered greatly to ancient Egyptians, and they devoted considerable attention to it. Both men and women wore kohl, a dark pigment applied around the eyes that created the distinctive lined look so recognizable in Egyptian art. This was not purely cosmetic. Kohl was also believed to have protective properties, guarding the eyes against the glare of the sun and perhaps against infection. Perfumes and scented oils were widely used, both for personal pleasure and for ritual purposes. Wealthier Egyptians wore jewelry, rings, necklaces, bracelets, and pectorals made from gold, faience, carnelian, turquoise, and lapis lazuli. Even those of modest means might wear a simple amulet, a small charm shaped like an eye or a scarab or a crouching goddess, believed to offer protection in daily life. Children in ancient Egypt were cherished. Tomb paintings and small objects recovered from homes showed children playing with toys, small wooden animals with moving parts, balls made from leather stuffed with grain husks, spinning tops, and carved dolls. Some of these objects have been found in children's graves, placed there so that the child would have familiar things in the afterlife. Children were depicted in art as miniature adults, as was common in many ancient cultures, but the care with which these small graves were arranged, the presence of beloved objects, tells a different story, one of parents who grieved, who wanted their children to have comfort even in death. The ancient Egyptians developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient world. Hieroglyphs, from the Greek for sacred carvings, were used on temple walls, monuments, coffins, and official documents from at least 3000 BCE. The system combined pictograms, phonetic signs, and determinatives in ways that allowed for enormous flexibility and nuance. Writing was a sacred act in Egypt. The god Thoth was believed to have invented writing, and the scribes who practiced it were members of a respected profession with access to knowledge, position, and influence unavailable to the illiterate majority. Learning to write required years of study, and scribes trained by copying texts repeatedly until their hand was sure and their knowledge of the hundreds of individual signs was complete. Alongside hieroglyphs, the Egyptians developed a more practical cursive script called hieratic, which was faster to write and better suited to everyday documents, letters, accounts, medical records, legal texts, and stories. Later still, an even more abbreviated script called demotic appeared. These different scripts served different purposes and different audiences, but they were all part of the same continuous tradition of recording, an Egyptian instinct to capture the world in words, to make the ephemeral permanent, to say to time, this happened, this person lived, this thought was thought. There is something deeply human in that impulse. The scribes of ancient Egypt were among the most important people in the civilization, and they knew it. A famous text called the Satire of the Trades was used as a training exercise for young scribes. It described the miseries and hardships of other professions in order to make the point that being a scribe was the finest thing one could be. The farmer's hands were raw, the soldier's life was dangerous, the metalworker's lungs were full of smoke. But the scribe sat in the shade, his reed pen in hand, his thoughts his own. Whether or not this picture was entirely fair, it tells us something about how Egyptians valued learning and the written word. Knowledge was understood as a kind of power, and the ability to write was a key that opened doors. Behind the beauty of Egypt stood a quiet world of officials, scribes, storehouses, and local governors. The country was divided into regions, each with its own traditions and needs, and no pharaoh could rule such a long river valley by command alone. Grain had to be measured, fields had to be counted after the flood, workers had to be fed, temples had to receive offerings. Boats, tools, taxes, and records all had to move in the right season. This was not the most glamorous part of Egypt, but it was one of the reasons Egypt could endure. A pyramid, a temple, or a royal tomb was never only a monument. It was the visible result of thousands of smaller actions done in order: quarrying, transport, rations, schedules, tools, crews, repairs, and supervision. The greatness of Egypt was royal, but it was also administrative. It lived in the hands of people whose names were often not carved in large letters, but whose work made large things possible. Papyrus, the tall reed that grew abundantly along the Nile, gave Egypt one of its most important exports and one of its most lasting contributions to world culture. The inner pith of the papyrus plant could be cut into thin strips, laid in overlapping layers, pressed together, and dried to create a smooth, flexible writing surface. Papyrus was lighter than clay tablets, easier to store, and could be rolled into scrolls for transport and preservation. Egyptian scribes used this material for everything from royal decrees to household accounts to magical spells to works of literature. Some of these scrolls survived in the dry Egyptian climate for thousands of years, preserved by conditions that would have destroyed them almost anywhere else. They remain among the most valuable records of the ancient world. Egyptian literature was rich, varied, and surprisingly human. Among the texts that survive are love poems, gentle, longing, often surprisingly tender, in which young men and women express their feelings in terms that would not be out of place in any age. There are adventure stories, like the tale of Sinew, in which an Egyptian official flees abroad and longs for home. There are wisdom texts offering advice on how to live well and behave properly. There are mathematical problems and medical manuals. There are hymns of extraordinary beauty addressed to the sun god Ra. Reading Egyptian literature is a reminder that behind every hieroglyph was a mind very much like ours, curious, emotional, storytelling, reaching across time. Medicine in ancient Egypt blended observation, ritual, and practical experience. Physicians examined symptoms, treated wounds, set bones, used honey on injuries, and recorded remedies for many conditions. Some ideas were magical by modern standards, but others show careful attention to the body and to what seemed to help. Healing belonged to a world where body, spirit, gods, and daily life were still deeply connected. The Egyptian calendar was one of humanity's early attempts to organize a full year with care. It followed the Nile, the seasons, and the stars. The civil year had 365 days, and the rising of Sirius before dawn helped signal the coming flood. Time in Egypt was not abstract. It was agricultural, religious, and practical, measured by water, light, work, and worship. Mathematics, too, served life. Egyptians used it to measure fields after the flood, calculate grain, design buildings, and plan work. Their mathematics was not abstract in the later Greek sense, but it was precise enough to solve real problems. In Egypt, numbers helped turn a changing river landscape into an organized civilization. The temples of ancient Egypt were not simply buildings. They were conceived of as the dwelling places of the gods, as houses in the most literal sense, where the divine could be present in the world. Each morning, priests would enter the inner sanctuary, break the seal on the shrine that held the deity's statue, wash and anoint it, dress it in fresh linen, and present it with offerings of food and water. This daily ritual was not symbolic. Egyptians believed the god truly inhabited the statue, truly received the offerings, truly needed this care. The temple was the meeting point between the human world and the divine world, and the rituals performed within it were believed to maintain the proper order of the universe. Without this constant tending, the gods might withdraw, and without the gods, the world would fall into chaos. The great temples of Egypt were also extraordinary works of architecture, engineering, and art. Walking into a temple like Karnak or Luxor meant passing through an avenue of sphinxes, through massive pylons, gateway towers covered in painted relief carvings, into open courts, then into progressively darker and more sacred spaces, the floors rising and the ceilings lowering as one moved closer to the divine presence at the temple's heart. The columns in these temples were often carved to resemble bundled papyrus stems or open lotus flowers, the plants of the Nile brought into the architecture of the sacred. Every surface was carved and painted, every image placed with intention. To stand in such a space was to be surrounded by the complete cosmological worldview of ancient Egypt. The gods of Egypt were numerous, complex, and always changing across the centuries. Ra carried the sun across the sky. Osiris ruled the afterlife and promised renewal. Isis protected with wisdom and magic. Horus embodied kingship. Anubis guided the dead. Hathor brought music, love, and joy. Thoth held writing and knowledge. The pantheon was not a fixed list, but a living language through which Egyptians spoke about nature, power, death, birth, fear, and hope. The myths of Egypt were not collected into a single fixed holy book. They lived in temple inscriptions, funerary texts, local traditions, hymns, rituals, and stories that changed across time. Different cities emphasized different gods. Heliopolis told creation through Adam and the divine family that followed him. Memphis gave creative power to Ptah, who brought the world into being through heart and tongue, through thought and speech. Hermopolis imagined a primeval group of 8 gods connected with the dark, watery chaos before creation. These different accounts did not necessarily cancel one another. Egyptian religion could hold multiple truths side by side, each meaningful within its own sacred context. One of the most important mythic patterns was the story of Osiris, Isis, Set, and Horus. Osiris, a good king, is murdered by his brother Set. Isis searches for him, mourns him, restores him through magic, and conceives their son Horus. Horus then struggles with Set for the throne. This story gave Egypt a powerful language for death, grief, legitimacy, and renewal. Every dead person could be identified with Osiris. Every living king could be identified with Horus. The murder of a king, the mourning of a wife, the birth of an heir, the defeat of disorder, all became part of the cosmic drama that helped Egyptians understand both politics and mortality. Isis became one of the most beloved goddesses of the ancient world because her story is so emotionally complete. She is wife, mourner, magician, protector, mother, and queen. She is powerful not through brute force but through devotion, intelligence, and speech. Her magic restores what violence has broken. Her wings shelter the vulnerable. In later centuries, her worship spread far beyond Egypt, throughout the Mediterranean world, carried by sailors, merchants, soldiers, and seekers of divine protection. Even after the old Egyptian temples declined, the image of a divine mother holding a sacred child remained one of the most enduring religious forms in the region. Set, too, was more complicated than a simple villain. He represented violence, desert, storm, foreignness, and disruption, but these forces were not always useless. In some traditions, Set helped defend the sun god against the serpent of chaos during the nightly journey through the underworld. Egypt understood that dangerous power could sometimes be protective if properly contained. This complexity is part of what makes Egyptian religion so rich. Gods were not flat characters. They were forces, relationships, local histories, symbols, and contradictions carried across centuries. The daily journey of the sun was one of the great religious dramas of Egyptian thought. Each morning Ra rose in triumph. Each evening he descended toward the underworld. Through the night, he traveled in a solar boat through dangerous regions, facing serpents, gates, and enemies, before being reborn at dawn. Sunrise was therefore not merely a natural event. It was victory renewed. Every morning proved that chaos had not won. Every day began because the divine order had survived the darkness. For a people whose lives depended on cycles, flood and harvest, life and death, day and night, this image of recurring renewal was central to hope. The concept of Ma'at was perhaps the most important idea in Egyptian thought. Ma'at meant truth, justice, balance, and right order. It was the harmony that kept the sun rising, the Nile flooding, families keeping promises, judges speaking fairly, and kings ruling as they should. When a person died, Their heart was weighed against the feather of Maat. If the heart was balanced, the soul could continue. If it was heavy with wrongdoing, the person was lost. In this simple image, Egypt placed its moral universe. The afterlife was not a distant or abstract concern for Egyptians. It was as real and immediate as the life being lived. Much of what we know about Egyptian culture comes from tombs, because the Egyptians buried their dead with extraordinary care and attention. The body had to be preserved so that the spirit could return to it. Food, clothing, tools, furniture, games, and beloved possessions were placed in the tomb so that the dead would want for nothing. The walls were painted with scenes of daily life, harvest, feasting, music, hunting in the marshes, so that these pleasures would be available forever. And spells were inscribed to protect the deceased on their journey and help them navigate the dangers of the underworld. Death was not an ending in Egyptian thought. It was a transition, demanding preparation, ritual, and care. Mummification was the physical expression of Egypt's belief in continuity. Specialists preserved the body over many weeks, drying it with natron, wrapping it in linen, and placing protective amulets among the bandages. The heart was usually left in place because it would be needed for judgment. What can seem strange from a distance was, for Egyptians, an act of care. To preserve the body was to help the person continue their journey. The Book of the Dead gathered spells, prayers, and instructions to help the deceased pass safely through the afterlife. Wealthy people could commission beautifully illustrated copies with their own names written into the text. Others used simpler versions. These writings were not only comforting. They were tools for a dangerous journey, words meant to open doors, answer guardians, and guide the soul toward peace. The Old Kingdom, the age of the Great Pyramids, did not begin with the Great Pyramid. It began with experimentation. Early royal tombs were mastabas, rectangular structures with sloping sides, built above underground burial chambers. They were impressive, but they still belonged to an older architectural world. Then, during the Third Dynasty, something changed. A king named Djoser and an architect named Imhotep imagined a tomb that would not simply lie low against the desert, but rise upward, step by step, toward the sky. Imhotep is one of the first named creative minds in world history. Later Egyptians remembered him not merely as an architect, but as a sage, a healer, and eventually a god of wisdom and medicine. Whether every later story about him is true is less important than the reverence itself. Egypt understood that building something new required a kind of genius. At Saqqara, Djoser's step pyramid began as a mastaba and grew into a six-stepped monument of stone, surrounded by a vast ceremonial complex. It was architecture as transformation, the old form lifted into something no one had seen before. The move from mud brick to stone mattered deeply. Mud brick was practical for houses, palaces, and many everyday buildings, but stone spoke a different language. Stone suggested permanence. Stone made a promise to time. The step pyramid complex imitated earlier materials in a new medium. Stone columns carved to resemble bundles of reeds, stone walls shaped as if they were lighter structures, stone doors that would never open. It was as if Egypt was taking the temporary world of life and translating it into a durable world for eternity. After Djoser, pyramid building became an arena of ambition and learning. Pharaoh Sneferu, founder of the Fourth Dynasty, built not one pyramid but several, and his monuments show the trial and error process by which Egyptians learned to create the true, smooth-sided pyramid. At Mitam, a stepped form was transformed, or attempted to be transformed, into a smooth pyramid. At Dashur, the bent pyramid rises at one angle and then changes slope partway up, likely because the original design created structural problems. Nearby, the red pyramid achieved a more stable form and became one of the earliest successful true pyramids. These were not failures in any simple sense. They were experiments in stone, each teaching the builders something that the next project would use. By the time Khufu's Great Pyramid rose at Giza, Egypt had gathered generations of experience. The monument did not come from nowhere. It was the result of accumulated knowledge, surveying, quarrying, transport, mathematics, labor organization, and religious imagination. The Great Pyramid is often surrounded today by strange theories because people find it difficult to believe that ancient human beings could have achieved such precision without modern machines. But the more respectful answer is also the more impressive one. They achieved it because they had skill, time, organization, and a worldview that made such labor meaningful. Giza itself became a royal landscape. Khufu's pyramid, Khafre's pyramid, Menkaur's pyramid, the Queen's pyramids, mortuary temples, causeways, boat pits, tombs of officials, and the Sphinx all belong to a carefully arranged sacred and political environment. It was not a lonely monument in empty sand. It was a city of the dead connected to the city of the living. Priests served cults for deceased kings. Offerings moved through storerooms. Families of officials built tombs nearby, wishing to remain close to royal power even in death. The plateau was a place of work, ritual, memory, and prestige. Yet the age of the pyramids also carried a cost. Monumental building required enormous resources, and over time, the power of local officials grew. Royal authority, so concentrated in the Fourth Dynasty, became more distributed. Long reigns, economic strain, climate pressures, and political decentralization all contributed to the weakening of the Old Kingdom. Later Egyptians remembered the collapse that followed as a time of distress, when orders seemed to break and the old certainties could no longer hold. The pyramids remained, but the world that had built them changed. The pyramids are the most recognizable monuments in human history, and they continue to astonish. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, remained the tallest human-made structure in the world for nearly 4,000 years. It contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, with an average weight of around 2.5 tons each, though some blocks weigh considerably more. The precision of its construction is remarkable. The four sides are aligned to the cardinal points of the compass with extraordinary accuracy. The base is almost perfectly level, and the corners are very nearly perfect right angles. How the Egyptians achieved this precision with the tools available to them remains a subject of ongoing study and genuine wonder. What is not in doubt is that they did it, and that the people who built these monuments were skilled, organized, and determined. The pyramid builders have been the subject of many misconceptions over the centuries, but modern archaeology has answered some important questions. In the 1990s, a workers' village was discovered near the Giza Plateau, a substantial settlement with bakeries, breweries, fish processing areas, and sleeping quarters. Analysis of animal bones found at the site suggests that workers ate beef, sheep, and goat in quantities that indicate they were being well fed by the state. Their skeletons show the physical stress of heavy labor, but also evidence of medical care, healed fractures, signs of surgical intervention. These were not anonymous, faceless laborers. They were Egyptians engaged in an enormous national project, and the state that employed them took responsibility for their well-being. Some of the overseers' tombs near the workers' village contain their names and their titles. They were real people, and they have not been entirely forgotten. The Great Sphinx of Giza is a reclining lion with a human head, carved from the limestone bedrock of the plateau. It has watched the desert for thousands of years, buried and uncovered by sand more than once. Later Egyptians restored it and treated it with reverence, as if it already belonged to a deep and mysterious past. The dream stele of Thutmose IV, placed between its paws, tells of a prince who slept in its shadow and dreamed that the statue promised him kingship if he cleared the sand away. The first intermediate period is one of the most revealing chapters of Egyptian history precisely because it shows what Egyptians feared. After the Old Kingdom weakened, the unity of the two lands broke down. Local rulers gained more independence. Competing dynasties claimed legitimacy. The old image of Egypt as a single, perfectly ordered kingdom gave way to a more fragmented landscape. Later literary texts describe hunger, social reversal, and the breakdown of proper behavior. We should read these texts carefully because they are not neutral newspapers. They are shaped by ideology and memory. But they still tell us something important. Egyptians understood political collapse as more than a change of government. They felt it as a wound in the order of the world. Out of this fragmentation came renewal. The Middle Kingdom emerged when rulers from Thebes reunified Egypt and restored central authority. This period has often been called Egypt's classical age, not because it was the largest or wealthiest, but because it produced a deep, reflective culture. Literature from the Middle Kingdom has a thoughtful, sometimes anxious quality. Stories and wisdom texts ask what makes a good ruler, what happens when order fails, how a person should live, and how fragile prosperity can be. The Egyptians had learned that civilization was not automatic. It had to be maintained. Middle Kingdom kings presented themselves not only as divine rulers, but as shepherds of the people. They built fortresses in Nubia, expanded irrigation works, especially in the Fayum, and strengthened administration. Their portraits sometimes show faces that are not serenely perfect, but lined, serious, almost burdened. Whether these images are realistic in a modern sense is not the point. They communicate a new royal mood. Kingship as responsibility, not only triumph. The ruler had to listen, judge, build, defend, and keep the country from sliding back toward disorder. This period also widened Egypt's relationship with the lands around it. Nubia to the south was important for gold, trade routes, soldiers, cattle, and cultural exchange. The Levant to the northeast connected Egypt with cities, merchants, timber, and political rivalries. Egypt was never as isolated as a map of the Nile Valley might suggest. Its desert borders were difficult, but they were crossed by miners, traders, diplomats, migrants, soldiers, and refugees. Foreign goods entered Egyptian life. Foreign people settled in Egyptian towns. Some rose to positions of influence. Egypt defined itself strongly, but it was always in conversation with the wider world. Then came another period of division, and with it one of the most dramatic shocks in Egyptian history, the rule of the Hyksos. These rulers, of Western Asian origin, established power in the Eastern Nile Delta during the Second Intermediate Period. Later Egyptian tradition portrayed them as foreign oppressors, and the memory of their rule became charged with humiliation and anger. Modern archaeology gives a more complicated picture, showing long-term cultural contact, settlement, and exchange before political control. But for later Egyptian kings, the Hyksos represented a painful fact. The two lands could be ruled, at least in part, by outsiders. The Hyksos period changed Egypt. The Egyptians adopted and adapted military technologies associated with the wider Near Eastern world, including the horse-drawn chariot, composite bows, and new forms of weaponry. When Theban rulers in the south began the struggle to expel the Hyksos, they did not simply restore the old Egypt. They helped create a new one. The wars of liberation taught Egypt to think more aggressively about its borders. Security would no longer mean waiting behind deserts and fortresses. It would mean projecting power outward. Ahmose I, the king who finally drove the Hyksos from Egypt and founded the 18th dynasty, opened the age we call the New Kingdom. This was Egypt's imperial age, the period when its armies marched deep into the Levant and Nubia, when gold and tribute flowed into Thebes, when temples grew to enormous scale, and when pharaohs presented themselves as world rulers. The trauma of foreign domination had produced a new political imagination. Egypt would not merely be protected, it would dominate the regions that had once threatened it. This is important because it changes the emotional tone of Egyptian history. The Old Kingdom looked upward, toward pyramids and eternal tombs. The Middle Kingdom looked inward, toward order restored after chaos. The New Kingdom looked outward, toward empire. Its kings were builders, warriors, diplomats, and performers of power on an international stage. They lived in a world of rival great powers: the Hittites, Mitanni, Babylonia, Assyria, and the city-states of Canaan. Egypt was no longer only the beloved land along the Nile. It was one of the central powers of the late Bronze Age world. The Valley of the Kings, on the west bank of the Nile across from Thebes, became the royal burial place of the New Kingdom. Instead of building pyramids visible from far away, pharaohs cut their tombs into a hidden desert valley. The chambers were painted with sacred texts and images meant to guide the king through the afterlife. Most were robbed long ago, which is why the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 was so astonishing. Howard Carter had searched the valley for years with the support of Lord Carnarvon. In November of 1922, his team uncovered steps leading to a sealed doorway. When Carter finally looked through a small opening into the chamber beyond, he saw gold, furniture, statues, strange animal forms, and objects crowded in the darkness. Asked whether he could see anything, he gave the answer that became famous: yes, wonderful things. Tutankhamun himself was not one of Egypt's greatest political rulers. He came to the throne as a child, ruled briefly, and died young. But his tomb preserved the world of royal death better than almost any other discovery. The golden mask shows an eternal face, calm and perfect, while the body beneath it belonged to a young man whose life ended before it had fully begun. That contrast gives the tomb its haunting power. The pharaoh stood at the intersection of the human and the divine. The word pharaoh itself is derived from an Egyptian phrase meaning great house, and it was originally used to refer to the royal palace rather than the king himself. Over time, it came to refer to the ruler. The pharaoh was not simply a king in the way that many ancient rulers were kings. He was understood to be divine, the earthly embodiment of Horus during his life and Osiris after his death. His role was cosmic as well as political. His proper performance of ritual maintained the order of the universe. His campaigns against foreign enemies were understood as the defeat of chaos. His construction of temples was understood as the creation of new sacred spaces where the gods could dwell. This made the pharaoh's office unlike almost anything in the modern world, a position of enormous religious weight as well as political power. The early New Kingdom produced rulers of remarkable energy. Thebes, once a regional power in the south, became the sacred heart of an empire. The god Ammonius, whose cult had risen with Theban power, became increasingly important, eventually merging with the sun god as Ammonisare. Karnak expanded across generations as kings poured wealth into its courts, pylons, obelisks, and sanctuaries. Each pharaoh wanted to be seen as the one who honored the god most magnificently. Religion, politics, architecture, and imperial wealth all reinforced one another. The New Kingdom also gave Egypt some of its most vivid royal personalities. Queens and royal women could exercise enormous influence, especially as mothers, wives, regents, and priestesses connected to temple institutions. The title God's Wife of Ammonius, held by royal women in certain periods, carried religious and political power. Royal marriage was not only family life. It was a structure through which legitimacy, succession, diplomacy, and divine favor were expressed. Behind many famous kings stood women whose names are less widely known, but whose influence shaped the court. It is within this world of restored power, Theban religion, and dynastic complexity that Hatshepsut appears. There were female pharaohs in Egyptian history, though they were not common. The most famous was Hatshepsut, who ruled in the 18th dynasty around 1500 BCE. She served initially as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, but she eventually took on full pharaonic titles and ruled Egypt in her own right for roughly 20 years. Under her rule, Egypt prospered. She organized a famous trading expedition to the distant land of Punt, returning with exotic goods including living myrrh trees. She built a spectacular mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, which still stands as one of the most beautiful architectural achievements in Egyptian history. After her death, there were attempts to erase her memory from the official record. Her images were defaced, her name chiseled off inscriptions. But the stone remembered, and modern archaeology has restored her to her proper place in history. The New Kingdom was perhaps the period of Egypt's greatest power and international influence. Pharaohs like Thutmose III extended Egyptian control into Canaan and Nubia. The empire brought great wealth to Egypt, tribute from subject peoples, trade goods from distant lands, raw materials for construction and craftsmanship. Thebes became one of the greatest cities in the world, its temples enriched over centuries by pharaoh after pharaoh, each adding their own halls and pylons and obelisks. The obelisk, a tall, tapering stone pillar with a pyramidal top, was a powerful symbol of solar worship, representing a ray of sunlight frozen in stone. Many Egyptian obelisks were later taken to Rome, Constantinople, Paris, London, and New York, where they still stand today as displaced monuments to a world long past. Thutmose III, the stepson and successor whose reign followed Hatshepsut's, became one of Egypt's greatest military rulers. Later generations sometimes called him the Napoleon of Egypt, though that modern comparison can obscure as much as it reveals. What matters is that Thutmose III turned Egypt into a power whose reach extended deep into the Levant. His campaigns were carefully recorded on temple walls, especially at Karnak, where the official account of the Battle of Megiddo presents him as a decisive and courageous commander. The campaign against Megiddo is one of the earliest battles in history for which we have a detailed narrative. According to Egyptian accounts, a coalition of Canaanite rulers gathered in rebellion, and Thutmose had to choose between safer routes and a narrow, dangerous pass that would bring his army near the enemy. He chose the risky path. The Egyptian army emerged near Megiddo, surprised its opponents, and won the field. Yet the soldiers stopped to plunder the abandoned enemy camp instead of immediately taking the city, allowing the defenders to retreat behind the walls. The siege that followed lasted months. The story is valuable not only because it glorifies a king, but because it contains such a recognizably human military detail. Victory delayed by the irresistible temptation of loot. Empire brought wealth, but it also brought delicate management. Conquered cities needed loyal rulers. Tribute had to arrive. Hostages, envoys, gifts, and marriages helped keep distant regions within Egypt's influence. The New Kingdom was not only a world of battles and temple reliefs. It was also a world of messages, negotiations, promises, and careful watching beyond the frontier. Amenhotep III inherited a rich and powerful Egypt and turned royal life into a display of magnificent confidence. His reign is remembered for temples, statues, diplomatic exchange, and the high status of Queen Tai. The Colossi of Memnon, two immense seated figures on the west bank at Thebes, still suggest the scale of his ambition, even though the great mortuary temple they guarded is mostly gone. The letters exchanged between Egypt and other rulers show something surprisingly familiar. Kings asking for gifts, measuring respect, arranging marriages, and complaining when what they received seemed insufficient. Gold, especially Egyptian gold, could be friendship, pressure, or insult depending on how it was sent. Behind the formal language was a very human world of pride and calculation. Akhenaten is one of the most enigmatic figures in Egyptian history. He ruled in the 14th century BCE, and during his reign he attempted something that had never been done before in Egypt: the suppression of the traditional polytheistic religion in favor of the exclusive worship of a single deity, the Aten, conceived of as the sun disk itself rather than a god in human or animal form. He moved the capital from Thebes to a new city he built in the desert called Akhenaten, modern Amarna. He had himself and his family depicted in art in a strange, elongated style unlike any Egyptian tradition before or after. His reign was short, and after his death the old religion was restored. His name was erased from monuments, and his new city was abandoned. The reasons for his religious revolution remain debated. What is not debated is that it represents one of the most radical experiments in the history of ancient religion. The Amarna period, as Akhenaten's reign and its immediate aftermath are often called, feels almost like a brief opening in the wall of Egyptian tradition. Suddenly we see the royal family in intimate scenes. Akhenaten and Nefertiti beneath the rays of the Aten, their daughters climbing on their laps, small hands touching faces, the sun disk extending little hands of light toward them. Egyptian art had always carried rules, but Amarna art bends those rules. Bodies lengthen, bellies soften, faces become narrow, lips full, gestures tender. Whether this reflects theology, court style, physical reality, or deliberate symbolic distortion remains debated, but the effect is unmistakable. For a short time, Egyptian art looked different from itself. Akhenaten's new city, Akhenaten, was built quickly on a previously unused stretch of desert beside the Nile. Boundaries steely carved into the cliffs declared the king's vision for the place. Palaces, temples, villas, workshops, and workers' villages rose with startling speed. Unlike traditional temples, which led into darker and more enclosed spaces, the temples of the Aten were open to sunlight. The god was not hidden in a dark sanctuary. The god was the visible radiance of the sun itself, pouring life down upon the royal family and, through them, upon the world. But religious revolution is not a simple matter of belief. Temples controlled wealth, land, employment, and prestige. To elevate the Aten and suppress other cults, especially that of Ammonius, was to disrupt powerful institutions. Priests lost influence. Traditional images and names were attacked. The capital moved away from Thebes. The change must have been felt not only in theology, but in livelihoods, loyalties, and local identities. To many Egyptians, the old gods were not abstractions. They were protectors of towns, families, professions, and the dead. Removing them from public life would have felt dangerous. After Akhenaten's death, the revolution collapsed quickly. The old gods returned. Akhenaten was abandoned. The young Tutankhamun changed his name to Tutankhamun, signaling the restoration of Ammonius. Later rulers treated Akhenaten and his immediate successors as illegitimate, erasing their names from king lists and dismantling parts of their monuments for reuse. Yet because erasure is never perfect, the Amarna period survived in fragments, and those fragments have fascinated the modern world. It is one of history's reminders that even a failed revolution can leave a very long shadow. Akhenaten's wife was Nefertiti, whose painted limestone bust is one of the most famous images from the ancient world. Her biography remains uncertain, but her prominence in Amarna art is clear. She appears not as a distant background figure, but as an active presence in royal and religious life. Some scholars have wondered whether she may have ruled after Akhenaten's death, though this remains debated. The reign of Ramesses II, who ruled for an extraordinary 66 years in the 13th century BCE, is sometimes considered the apex of New Kingdom power. He was a prolific builder. His monuments and inscriptions survive from one end of Egypt to the other, and he was particularly fond of carving his name over monuments built by earlier pharaohs, claiming them as his own. His most famous construction is the temple complex at Abu Simbel in Nubia, where 4 enormous seated statues of the pharaoh himself, each approximately 20 meters tall, guard the entrance to a rock-cut temple. The interior is aligned so precisely that twice a year, on 2 days of the year, around late February and late October, sunlight penetrates deep into the temple and illuminates the statues of the gods within, except for Ptah, god of the underworld, who remains in shadow. When Abu Simbel was threatened by the rising waters of Lake Nasser in the 1960s, an international campaign organized by UNESCO cut the entire temple from the cliff face and moved it to higher ground, a feat of modern engineering that honored an ancient one. Ramesses II is often remembered as the great builder, but he was also a master of royal image. He understood the power of repetition. His statues are everywhere. His cartouches appear across Egypt and Nubia. His face, idealized and youthful, looks out from temple walls as if age and time could not touch him. This was not vanity alone. In the ancient world, visibility was authority. A king whose image filled the land seemed present everywhere. A name carved deeply into stone became a claim against forgetting. The most famous military event of his reign was the Battle of Kadesh, fought against the Hittite Empire near the Orontes River in Syria. It was one of the largest chariot battles known from the ancient world, and it shows both the ambition and the danger of late Bronze Age imperial politics. Egyptian accounts present Ramesses as a heroic king who, when his army was surprised and scattered, stood almost alone against the enemy until reinforcements arrived. Hittite records and the broader political outcome suggest a more complicated result. Kadesh was not the decisive Egyptian triumph that temple walls proclaimed. It was, at best, a hard-fought confrontation after which both sides continued to negotiate power. What makes Kadesh especially fascinating is not only the battle but the peace that followed. Years later, Egypt and the Hittites concluded one of the earliest known international peace treaties. The two great powers recognized mutual interests, promised support, and eventually sealed their relationship with diplomatic marriage. The treaty survives in both Egyptian and Hittite versions, a reminder that even in the ancient world, war and diplomacy were intertwined. Glory might be carved on temple walls, but survival often required negotiation. Ramesses lived so long that his reign became an age in itself. Many of his sons died before him. Generations grew up knowing no other pharaoh. Longevity can create stability, but it can also create problems for succession. When Ramesses finally died, Egypt was still powerful, but the world around it was changing. The late Bronze Age system of palaces, trade routes, great kings, and diplomatic exchange was under pressure. Within a century, many of the old powers of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East would face crisis, collapse, or transformation. One of the most dramatic signs of this wider crisis appears in the reign of Ramesses II, a later pharaoh of the 20th dynasty. His inscriptions describe attacks by groups often called the Sea Peoples, who moved through the Eastern Mediterranean during a period of widespread instability. The exact identity and origins of these groups remain debated, and the Egyptian accounts are royal propaganda as well as historical evidence. But they reflect a real age of disruption. Cities burned, trade networks faltered, empires weakened, and populations moved. Egypt managed to survive these storms better than many states, but survival came at a cost. The empire in Asia was lost. Resources diminished. Internal strain increased. Ramesses II's reign also gives us one of the most remarkable documents of labor history. Evidence from Deir el-Medina, the village of the workers who built and decorated royal tombs, shows that workers went on strike when their rations were delayed. These were skilled state employees, artists and laborers whose work served the sacred project of royal eternity. Yet they still needed grain, fish, vegetables, and oil. When the system failed to provide, they stopped working and protested. The records of their complaint are deeply human. Even in a civilization devoted to gods and kings, workers knew when they had not been paid. Deir el-Medina itself is one of the most intimate places in Egyptian archaeology. Because the village housed the craftsmen of the royal tombs, and because the dry climate preserved enormous quantities of written material, we know unusual details about its inhabitants: family disputes, jokes, debts, love songs, accusations of theft, requests for time off, and arguments between neighbors. These people painted the afterlife for kings, but they also lived ordinary lives of irritation, affection, ambition, and fatigue. Their world reminds us that the makers of Egypt's most sacred images were not anonymous hands. They were individuals with houses, names, problems, and memories. The Egyptian army changed over time. In earlier periods, military activity often meant border defense, expeditions, or campaigns for resources. By the New Kingdom, after the Hyksos and the rise of empire, the army had become more organized and more central to power. Soldiers, archers, charioteers, officers, scouts, and foreign auxiliaries all helped carry Egypt's authority beyond the Nile. The chariot became one of the great symbols of New Kingdom warfare. In art, the pharaoh is often shown standing in a chariot, bow drawn, horses surging forward, enemies falling into confusion. These images are not simple battlefield records. They are royal messages. The king represents order. The enemy represents chaos. Victory becomes not only military success, but the restoration of the world. For ordinary soldiers, the experience was less polished than the art. Marches were hot and long. Supplies mattered. Fortresses needed garrisons. Letters and records speak of rations, assignments, discipline, and movement. Some men served for status or reward, some from obligation. The empire that looks so smooth on temple walls was lived by people who sweated, waited, feared, and hoped to return home. Diplomacy worked beside warfare. Royal marriages, envoys, gifts, treaties, and intelligence helped Egypt manage distant relationships. The pharaohs needed to know what was happening in Syria, Nubia, the Delta, and the courts of rival kings. Power was not only the ability to win a battle, it was also the ability to listen, remember, negotiate, and choose the right moment to act. Foreigners lived within Egypt, served Egypt, fought for Egypt, and sometimes ruled Egypt. Nubians, Libyans, people from the Levant, Greeks, and others entered Egyptian life in different periods. Egyptian identity remained strong, but Egypt was never sealed away from the world. The Nile connected as much as it protected. Trade brought Egypt what it lacked and spread what it had in abundance. Gold, linen, papyrus, grain, and crafted goods moved outward, while cedar, copper, silver, lapis lazuli, incense, horses, and luxury materials came in from distant places. Ships, caravans, merchants, officials, and diplomats all carried Egypt into a wider world. The Amarna letters, found at Akhenaten's abandoned capital, preserve some of this international world in clay. Written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the time, they show rulers requesting gold, arranging marriages, complaining about gifts, and trying to protect their interests. Their details can be dense, but their feeling is simple and recognizable. Power depends on relationships. Nubia, to the south, had one of the longest and deepest relationships with Egypt. Sometimes Egypt controlled Nubian lands and resources. Sometimes Nubia resisted. And in the 8th century BCE, rulers from Kush conquered Egypt and became pharaohs themselves. The relationship was never only conquest. It was exchange, rivalry, imitation, influence, and shared life along the river. The cats of Egypt occupy a special place in history and imagination. While cats were domesticated for practical purposes, keeping rodents away from grain stores, they gradually acquired sacred status in Egyptian religion. The goddess Badet was depicted as a cat or as a woman with a cat's head. She was associated with home, fertility, and protection. Cats were beloved household animals, and when a household cat died, family members shaved their eyebrows as a sign of mourning. Injuring or killing a cat, even accidentally, could result in severe punishment. At sites dedicated to Batet, hundreds of thousands of mummified cats have been found, offered to the goddess by devotees seeking her favor. The elevation of the cat from useful animal to sacred creature is a distinctly Egyptian development, and from Egypt, the cat's special place in human affection has never diminished. Other animals were also venerated in Egypt, sometimes to an extraordinary degree. The Apis bull, kept at Memphis and believed to be an earthly manifestation of the god Ptah, lived a life of exceptional privilege, housed in a grand stable, adorned with ceremonial regalia, and worshipped by pilgrims from across Egypt. When an Apis bull died, it was mummified with elaborate care and interred in a special underground gallery called the Serapeum, in a massive granite sarcophagus. The ibis was sacred to Thoth, and millions of ibis mummies have been found at sites across Egypt. The baboon, the falcon, the crocodile, the cobra, nearly every creature that shared the Nile Valley with the Egyptians had some sacred significance. This does not mean that Egyptians worshipped animals in a simple or uncritical way. Their religious thinking was sophisticated and varied, but it does reflect a profound orientation toward the natural world as charged with divine meaning. The role of women in ancient Egypt was, by the standards of the ancient world, relatively substantial. Women could own property, enter into contracts, initiate divorce, and testify in legal proceedings. They could be landowners, priestesses, and physicians. They ran households and managed estates. In some periods and at some levels of society, women worked alongside men in crafts and trades. The legal status of women varied across time and social class, and it would be a mistake to project modern ideas onto the ancient world. But compared to many contemporary civilizations, Egyptian women had a degree of legal standing and social agency that stands out. This is reflected not only in texts and laws, but in the art. Egyptian women are depicted as fully present, as individuals with expressions and dignity, not as shadows or afterthoughts. The cities of Egypt were not all like the monumental landscapes that survive most visibly today. Many were built of mud brick, and mud brick returns to earth unless it is protected by dry conditions or buried quickly. This means that the everyday urban world of Egypt is harder to see than its temples and tombs. Yet cities and towns were the living heart of the civilization. Memphis, near the point where the Nile Valley opened into the delta, was one of the great administrative capitals. Thebes became a sacred and political center of the new kingdom. Alexandria, much later, became a Mediterranean metropolis. Smaller towns, temple communities, quarry settlements, military posts, and planned villages filled the spaces between these famous names. A street in an Egyptian town would have felt alive with texture. Walls of sun-dried brick, doorways shaded against heat, rooftop spaces where people might sleep on warm nights, storage jars set against walls, animals moving through narrow lanes, the smell of baking bread, fish, oil, smoke, and river mud. Workshops produced pottery, linen, jewelry, tools, furniture, baskets, leather goods, and carved objects. Potters shaped clay vessels in forms so useful that they changed slowly across generations. Carpenters worked with precious wood, often imported, because large trees were not abundant in Egypt. Metalworkers shaped copper, bronze, gold, and electrum. Jewelers combined color and symbolism with extraordinary skill. Markets were places of exchange, though Egypt did not rely on coinage for most of its pharaonic history. Goods and labor were valued through systems of barter, ration, weight, and accounting. Grain was central. Cloth, oil, beer, livestock, fish, vegetables, and manufactured goods moved through households and institutions. A person might be paid in rations, exchange goods with a neighbor, owe labor to an estate, or receive supplies through a temple or state system. The economy was not modern, but it was not simple. It depended on trust, record-keeping, habit, and the constant flow of agricultural surplus from the fields. Craftsmanship in Egypt often carried religious meaning even when it served practical needs. A coffin painter was not merely decorating wood. He was helping shape a person's eternity. A sculptor carving a statue was not merely making a likeness. He was creating a possible vessel of presence. A jeweler setting a scarab or eye amulet into a necklace was not merely making something pretty. He was arranging protection, color, and symbolism around the body. This is one reason Egyptian objects can feel so charged. The line between beauty and function, between ornament and belief, was thin. The artisans who worked on royal tombs and temples were highly trained. They followed conventions, but also made choices. Egyptian art is sometimes misunderstood as stiff because it uses repeated poses, profile faces, frontal eyes, and carefully ordered proportions. But these conventions were not signs of inability. They were visual grammar. They allowed artists to show the most recognizable and complete form of a thing. The head from the side, the eye from the front, the shoulders broad, the legs in stride. The goal was not a passing moment seen from one angle. The goal was a durable truth that could function forever. Within those rules, artists achieved elegance, humor, tenderness, and individuality. Some of the most beautiful surviving Egyptian objects are not royal at all. A wooden model of a boat with rowers, a painted box, a pair of sandals, a comb, a child's toy, a linen tunic, a workman's sketch on limestone, a letter from one family member to another. These things do not shout across history the way a pyramid does. They speak more softly, but they may bring us closer to life as it was lived. A civilization is not only what it builds at its largest, it is also what it touches every day. Music accompanied religious ceremonies, feasts, work, military movement, and funerals. Egyptians played harps, flutes, lutes, clappers, sistrums, and drums. We cannot hear their melodies now, but the care with which musicians and instruments appear in art suggests that music was not a small extra pleasure. It was part of how Egyptians honored gods, marked occasions, and filled life with rhythm. Board games were also loved. The most famous was Senet, played on a board of 30 squares and later connected with the soul's journey through the afterlife. Tutankhamun was buried with several game boards. Even here, in leisure, Egypt found symbolic meaning. A game could be a pastime, a comfort, and a small model of passage from one state to another. Scribal schools, sometimes connected with temples, trained young students in writing, calculation, religious texts, and literature. Students practiced on broken pottery and flakes of limestone because papyrus was valuable. Some exercises still survive, with mistakes, corrections, and repeated lines. They bring us close to the patient, frustrating, very human process of learning. The obelisk was one of Egypt's most powerful symbols, and its story did not end with Egypt. When Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, Roman emperors were fascinated by Egyptian culture and brought obelisks back to Rome as trophies and symbols of power. 13 Egyptian obelisks now stand in Rome, more than in Egypt itself. Other obelisks were taken to Istanbul, Paris, London, and New York's Central Park. The obelisk called Cleopatra's Needle in London, which has nothing to do with Cleopatra and is actually much older, dating to the reign of Thutmose III, was transported from Alexandria to the Thames embankment in 1878 in an extraordinary engineering operation. A time capsule was buried beneath it containing, among other things, a railway timetable, a set of the day's newspapers, and photographs of 12 of the most beautiful women in Britain. Egypt's monuments have always attracted additions from the people who encountered them. The Rosetta Stone is perhaps the most famous archaeological object in the world, and its discovery changed everything. Found by French soldiers during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign in 1799 near the city of Rosetta, now called Rashid, in the Nile Delta, the stone bears the same priestly decree in 3 scripts: hieroglyphs at the top, Demotic in the middle, and Greek at the bottom. Because Greek was well understood by European scholars, it provided the key to deciphering the other 2 scripts. The work of decipherment took decades and involved scholars across Europe, but the decisive breakthrough came in 1822 when the French scholar Jean-François Champollion, building on earlier work by Thomas Young, demonstrated that hieroglyphs were not purely symbolic, but were a mixed system combining phonetic and pictorial elements. With this realization, the silence of thousands of years of Egyptian writing was finally broken. The past could speak again. Before Champollion's decipherment, ancient Egypt was known to Europeans primarily through the accounts of Greek and Roman writers, through the Bible, and through the physical remains that were visible above ground. These accounts were often distorted by distance, misunderstanding, and a tendency to project meaning onto things that were not understood. After decipherment, Egypt could speak for itself. The texts on temple walls and papyrus scrolls revealed a world of extraordinary complexity and richness, a world that had been effectively invisible for 1,500 years. The 19th century was an age of intense Egyptological discovery, as scholars, adventurers, collectors, and archaeologists, with varying degrees of method and respect for the material, explored, documented, and sometimes removed the physical remains of the ancient civilization. The discipline of archaeology developed partly in response to the methodological challenges that Egypt posed. The Dendera temple complex, dedicated to the goddess Hathor and constructed largely during the Ptolemaic period, the centuries following Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt, is one of the best preserved temple complexes in Egypt. Its roof is intact, its colors are still vivid in sheltered areas, and it offers an extraordinary experience of what an Egyptian sacred space felt like. Among its most famous features is a set of astronomical ceilings in the outer hypostyle hall, showing the Egyptians' sophisticated understanding of the night sky, constellations, planets, and the signs of the zodiac that were absorbed into Egyptian astronomy from Babylonian traditions during the late period. The Dendera zodiac, a circular bas-relief from the temple's ceiling now displayed in the Louvre, was one of the most debated objects of the early 19th century as scholars worked to understand what its signs and symbols meant. Water management was essential to Egyptian civilization, and the Egyptians developed sophisticated systems for controlling and distributing the Nile's waters. Basin irrigation, in which the flood waters were directed into large enclosed areas and held there until the silt settled and the water was drawn off, was practiced from very early in Egyptian history. As the civilization developed, more elaborate systems of canals, dikes, and drainage channels allowed for increasingly precise management of water resources. During periods of strong central government, these systems were maintained and extended. During periods of political fragmentation, the intermediate periods when Egypt broke into competing regional powers, the irrigation systems could deteriorate, leading to reduced agricultural output and social instability. The management of water was not just a technical matter. It was intimately connected to the political health of the civilization. The Fayum Oasis, a fertile depression to the southwest of Cairo fed by a channel from the Nile, was an important agricultural region throughout Egyptian history and the site of significant royal projects in the Middle Kingdom period. Pharaohs of the 12th dynasty undertook major land reclamation projects in the Fayum, draining marshland and creating new agricultural areas. The Fayum became particularly famous in the Roman period for a tradition of portrait painting that combines Egyptian and Greek artistic conventions. These so-called Fayum mummy portraits, painted on wood in encaustic or tempera technique and attached to the wrapped mummies of the deceased, are among the most striking and moving objects from the ancient world. They show individuals with direct, searching gazes and human particularity, young and old, male and female, that bridges the distance of 2,000 years in an instant. The later history of Egypt is often called a decline, but the word is too simple. Egypt changed rulers, lost and regained independence, absorbed foreign influences, and continued to create meaning. Even when political power weakened, temples still functioned, scribes still wrote, farmers still watched the river, and the old forms of Egyptian life continued to adapt. The 25th dynasty, the dynasty of Kushite pharaohs, is especially important because it overturns simple ideas about cultural influence. For centuries, Egypt had projected power southward into Nubia. But in the 8th century BCE, rulers from Kush came north and took the Egyptian throne. They respected Egyptian religious traditions, supported temples, and built pyramids of their own in Nubia. Their rule was not a rejection of Egyptian civilization, but a powerful claim to preserve and renew it. The story of Egypt and Nubia is therefore not one of one culture simply dominating another. It is a long conversation along the Nile, sometimes violent, sometimes reverent, always intertwined. Persian rule brought Egypt into the vast Achaemenid Empire. Some Egyptians resisted, others served within the new order, and the old temples continued under changing political conditions. Egypt had lost some of its freedom, but not its identity. Alexander's conquest in 332 BCE changed Egypt again. He was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule, honored Egyptian religious traditions, and founded Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast. That city would become one of the greatest centers of learning and trade in the ancient world. Ptolemaic Egypt lived with a double identity. In temples, the Greek rulers appeared as traditional pharaohs, offering to Egyptian gods. In Alexandria, scholars wrote in Greek, debated philosophy, studied mathematics, and collected books. The country was ancient and cosmopolitan at the same time. The Ptolemaic period lasted from Alexander's conquest until the death of Cleopatra VII. It was a time of cultural mixture, royal ambition, court intrigue, and intellectual brilliance. Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, and other communities lived within the same kingdom, sometimes together, sometimes uneasily, but always within the long shadow of the Nile. The Library of Alexandria became a symbol of human knowledge. It aimed to gather texts from across the Greek-speaking world and beyond. Scholars associated with Alexandria shaped mathematics, geography, medicine, astronomy, and literature. Its decline remains one of history's great losses, but its ideal survives: the dream that knowledge can be collected, protected, and shared. Cleopatra VII, the last independent ruler of Egypt, was far more than the romantic figure later legend made of her. She was politically intelligent, multilingual, and determined to preserve her kingdom in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were personal, but they were also strategic, part of a struggle to keep Egypt from becoming another Roman possession. Cleopatra's Egypt was not the Egypt of pyramid builders, but she understood the power of that older inheritance. She presented herself in Egyptian religious terms, associated herself with Isis, and took part in the traditions of pharaonic rule. At the same time, she was a Hellenistic monarch, raised in the political culture of Alexandria, educated in rhetoric, diplomacy, and the dangerous arts of survival among royal relatives who often became rivals. The Ptolemaic court was brilliant, but it was also ruthless. Family members married one another, betrayed one another, and sometimes killed one another in the struggle for the throne. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt during the Roman civil wars, Cleopatra was fighting for power against her brother. Her alliance with Caesar restored her position and linked Egypt's fate more closely than ever to Rome. After Caesar's assassination, the Roman world fractured again, and Cleopatra allied herself with Mark Antony. Their relationship has been romanticized for centuries, but it was also a political partnership. Antony needed wealth, ships, and Eastern support. Cleopatra needed a Roman ally strong enough to protect Egyptian independence and the future of her children. The final struggle against Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, became a battle not only of armies but of propaganda. Octavian portrayed Antony as corrupted by an Eastern queen and Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign seductress threatening Roman virtue. This image was politically useful, and it shaped much of the later Roman memory of her. Behind it stood a more serious reality. Egypt was rich, strategically vital, and too important for Rome to leave independent. When Antony and Cleopatra were defeated after the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, the end came quickly. Alexandria fell the next year. Antony died. Cleopatra died soon after, traditionally said to have used the bite of an asp, though the exact method remains uncertain. With her death, Egypt ceased to be an independent kingdom. Octavian took control and made Egypt his personal province, too valuable to be entrusted to the Senate. The grain of Egypt would feed Rome. The wealth of Egypt would strengthen the new imperial system. The old title of pharaoh continued in temple imagery for Roman emperors, but the center of decision had moved away. A story that had begun with villages along the Nile and kings at Abydos had entered a new chapter under foreign rule. And yet, endings in Egypt are rarely absolute. The temples did not all close at once. The language did not vanish in a day. Priests continued rituals. Scribes continued writing. Farmers continued watching the river. Children were born, bread was baked, letters were sent, disputes were argued, and the dead were mourned. Political independence ended, but Egyptian life continued. This is one of the quiet truths of history. Civilizations can fall as states and still survive as languages, habits, landscapes, memories, and sacred gestures. Under Roman rule, Egypt became one of the empire's most valuable provinces because its grain helped feed Rome. The old temples did not vanish immediately, and emperors could still appear in Egyptian style on temple walls. But Egypt was no longer the center of its own political story. Christianity added another layer to Egypt's spiritual history. Alexandria became an important Christian center, and the deserts gave rise to some of the earliest forms of monastic life. Old symbols, languages, and habits did not disappear in a single moment. They changed slowly, overlapping with new beliefs. The Arab conquest in the 7th century brought another transformation. Arabic gradually replaced Greek and Coptic in daily use, while Coptic survived in the liturgy of Egypt's Christian community. Through Coptic, the last form of the ancient Egyptian language still echoes in religious life today. The desert of Egypt preserved not only monuments, but also organic materials, wood, textiles, leather, papyrus, that would have decayed in almost any other climate. This preservation has given archaeologists access to a remarkable range of everyday objects. Baskets, sandals, combs, hairpins, children's toys, personal letters, grocery lists, love letters, court documents, school exercises. All of these have survived in the Egyptian desert to illuminate the texture of ordinary life in ways that are simply not available for most ancient civilizations. When scholars discovered a cache of letters preserved in the dry earth of the Fayum region dating to the 3rd century CE, letters between family members dealing with the mundane concerns of daily life, worrying about money, asking for news, sending affection across distances, the human presence in those documents was immediately recognizable and deeply touching. The Egyptians paid careful attention to the sky. Their astronomical knowledge was embedded in their religion, their calendar, their architecture, and their daily life. The orientation of many Egyptian temples appears to have been deliberately aligned with significant astronomical events. The rising of specific stars, the position of the sun at particular times of year. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an accuracy that remains impressive even by modern standards. The star Thuban in the constellation Draco served as the North Pole star during the period when the pyramids were built, and a shaft in the Great Pyramid's interior may have been aligned with it. Egyptian astronomy was not pure science in the modern sense. It was intertwined with religion and cosmological belief, but it was careful observation, systematic recording, and practical application over very long periods of time. The deserts around the Nile held resources that shaped Egyptian power: gold, natron, copper, turquoise, alabaster, and granite. These materials had to be found, quarried, guarded, and transported, sometimes across very difficult landscapes. Every shining object in a tomb and every massive stone in a temple carried a hidden story of labor, distance, and planning. The sycamore fig tree holds a special place in Egyptian mythology and everyday life. In the stories that Egyptians told about the world beyond death, the sycamore fig stands at the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and a goddess, often Nut or Hathor, reaches from within its branches to offer water and bread to the souls of the newly dead. In the physical world, the sycamore provided shade, fruit, and wood for coffin making. Its presence in both the mythological and practical landscape of Egypt reflects something typical of how Egyptians thought. The sacred and the everyday were not separate categories, but intertwined aspects of a single continuous reality. Flowers were an important part of Egyptian life. Lotus flowers, white and blue, were ubiquitous in Egyptian art and were also used in garlands and bouquets for ceremonies and feasts. Papyrus flowers were architecturally transformed into the columns of great temples. Mandrake fruit, cornflowers, and poppies appeared in decorative art. Guests at banquets were sometimes shown wearing elaborate floral collars. Funerary bouquets, real dried flowers placed in tombs or woven into garlands laid on mummies, have survived in some cases and give us direct sensory connections to the ancient world. When a wreath of cornflowers and olive leaves was found draped across the coffin in Tutankhamun's tomb, the colors were still faintly visible, still carrying something of the care with which it was placed there more than 3,000 years before. The sound of the ancient world reaches us only indirectly. No recordings exist, but from instruments found in tombs, from depictions of musical performance in art, and from texts that describe musical occasions, we can make informed guesses about what Egyptian music sounded like. The harp was a melody instrument, likely producing warm, sustained tones. The aulos, a double-reed pipe, would have produced a more penetrating, nasal sound. Clappers and sistrums provided rhythm. In religious settings, music was described as something that pleased the gods, that opened the divine presence, that accompanied the sacred rituals of temple life. In secular settings, music accompanied feasting, dancing, labor, and celebration. The singer, the harpist, the flautist, these figures appear again and again in Egyptian art as people whose contribution to life was valued and whose craft was taken seriously. The Egyptian concept of the soul was complex and multifaceted, involving several distinct elements that together constituted a complete person. The Ka was the vital life force, the animating energy that a person was born with, and that required sustenance even after death, which is why offerings of food and drink were placed in tombs. The Ba was something closer to the personality or individual character, often depicted as a human-headed bird. It could leave the tomb during the day and return at night. The Ak was the transformed, glorified spirit of the deceased who had successfully completed the journey to the afterlife. The shadow, the name, and the heart were also considered components of a full person. Death in Egyptian thought was not a simple ending, but a complex transformation, a passage through different states of being, requiring ritual preparation and continuing support from the living. The relationship between the living and the dead was not severed by death. It was maintained through regular offerings, prayers, and the spoken aloud reading of the dead person's name. To speak a name was to make a person live. The workers' graffiti found at some Egyptian sites offer unexpectedly intimate glimpses into the minds of the people who built the great monuments. The gangs of workers who cut and moved stones sometimes named themselves with cheerful irreverence, names like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkaure. In the Valley of the Kings, graffiti left by the workers who dug the royal tombs show men noting that they visited a site, that they admired a particular scene, that they were present when a certain tomb was sealed. Some graffiti mark administrative records. Some seem to be simple expressions of presence, the ancient equivalent of "I was here." These scratchings on stone surfaces are some of the most human traces in all of Egyptian archaeology. The temples of Karnak and Luxor in ancient Thebes were not separate structures, but formed part of a single great religious complex, connected in antiquity by an avenue of sphinxes more than 2 kilometers long. This avenue, called the Avenue of Sphinxes, has been progressively excavated and restored over recent decades, and a major section was revealed to the public in recent years in a remarkable ceremony. Walking the avenue is to walk a processional route used during the Opet festival, when the statue of the god Ammonius was carried in procession from Karnak to Luxor in an annual celebration of royal power and divine renewal. The festival was one of the most important in the Egyptian calendar, lasting several weeks and drawing people from across Egypt to participate in the spectacle and the offerings that accompanied the divine journey. Modern Egyptology has its own complicated history. For a long time, European collectors and archaeologists removed objects, damaged sites, and treated Egypt as a place to be possessed. At the same time, documentation, decipherment, excavation, and conservation opened the ancient world in new ways. The field carries both discovery and responsibility. Today, Egyptian archaeology is increasingly led and shaped by Egyptian scholars, conservators, workers, and institutions. New discoveries still appear, but the questions have changed. The goal is not only to find beautiful objects, it is to understand lives, landscapes, labor, belief, and the long continuity of a civilization. Egypt never stopped discovering itself. Satellite imaging, careful excavation, DNA studies, CT scans, and renewed work at older sites continue to add knowledge. Each discovery changes the picture a little. Egypt is not a finished subject. It is a living field of inquiry. One of the most extraordinary discoveries connected to the Pyramid Age came from Wadi al-Jarf, an ancient harbor on the Red Sea coast. There, archaeologists found papyri from the reign of Khufu, including the journal of an official named Mirror, who helped transport limestone for the Great Pyramid. His ordinary work notes survived for 45 centuries, bringing one of the world's most famous monuments suddenly close to daily life. The lotus flower that appears so often in Egyptian art and religion has a biology perfectly suited to its symbolic role. The lotus closes each evening and sinks beneath the water, then rises again each morning to open its petals to the sun. For the Egyptians, this daily cycle of submersion and emergence was a perfect image of creation and renewal. The same pattern enacted each morning when Ra rose over the horizon, and each year when the Nile flood receded to reveal the fertile black earth. The blue lotus also has mild narcotic properties that were apparently known and sometimes used in ritual contexts. The flower's connection to beauty, to the sun, and to the cycle of rebirth made it one of the most loaded symbols in Egyptian visual culture, a small, elegant, persistently reappearing reminder of the order at the heart of things. The ancient Egyptians mummified not only human beings but an extraordinary range of animals: cats, ibises, baboons, crocodiles, dogs, bulls, hawks, and many others. These animal mummies served different purposes. Some were sacred animals venerated during their lifetimes and given elaborate burials after death. Others were votive offerings, purchased by pilgrims and dedicated to a deity as a form of prayer or thanksgiving. The industry around animal mummification was substantial, involving dedicated workshops, specialist embalmers, and networks of priests and traders. At some sites, millions of animal mummies have been found. Modern X-ray and CT scanning of animal mummies has revealed that many are exactly what they appear to be, but some were apparently fraudulent offerings, bundles of mud or straw or feathers presented as mummified animals. Even in ancient Egypt, commerce found ways to meet demand. The relationship between ancient Egypt and the concept of eternity is one that is worth sitting with for a moment. The Egyptians did not simply hope for life after death. They built for it, planned for it, invested enormous resources in it, and organized much of their civilization around the assumption that death was a passage to somewhere else rather than an ending. This orientation gave their culture a distinctive quality, an investment in things that would last, in stone rather than mud brick for the most sacred structures, in images carved deeply rather than painted lightly, in words inscribed on durable surfaces rather than whispered into the air. The pyramids, still standing after 4,500 years, are the most visible expression of this orientation. But it runs through everything Egyptian: the care taken with the dead, the detail lavished on painted tomb walls that were sealed and never seen again, the prayers repeated daily for the sustenance of spirits who could no longer speak. Egyptian thought held more than one kind of eternity. One form was enduring continuity, the wish that a name, body, monument, or truth might last. Another was recurring time: sunrise after darkness, flood after dryness, harvest after waiting. Egypt lived between these two feelings, the stillness of stone and the motion of the river. The hieroglyph for the word life was the Ankh, a cross with a loop at the top. This simple, elegant sign appeared throughout Egyptian art and architecture, held in the hands of gods as a gift to the living, offered to the nostrils of the pharaoh as the breath of life. It was one of the most common decorative elements in Egyptian visual culture. Its exact origin and symbolism have been debated by scholars for generations. Some see it as a sandal strap, others as a representation of the morning sun rising above the horizon, others as something more abstract. What is beyond question is its emotional resonance for the Egyptians themselves. Life, that particular gift, that ongoing miracle, was something they treasured, celebrated, and worked to prolong in every form available to them, both in this world and in whatever might come after. The story of ancient Egypt is not simply a story of kings and monuments, of gold and stone. It is also the story of a farmer pressing seeds into flood-dark earth at the edge of a river, of a child chasing a cat through a narrow lane between houses in the early morning, of a woman kneading bread in her kitchen while her neighbor calls something from across the shared wall. of a scribe dipping a reed pen into black ink and shaping, with great care, the symbols that will carry a thought across thousands of years. Of a priest in the cool shadows of a temple, speaking words to a stone statue that he believed could hear. Of an old man sitting in the evening light, watching the Nile run past, feeling the day slow toward its close. These people are gone now, as all people go. But the record they left behind is extraordinary, not just in its scale and its ambition, but in its humanity. The small things survive alongside the great. A child's toy beside a royal throne. A love poem beside a royal decree. A grocery list beside a philosophical treatise. The entirety of it, taken together, forms one of the most complete pictures we have of human beings living their lives in the ancient world. Their fears and hopes, their pleasures and their losses, their gods and their humor and their love for the people around them. Egypt endured because it was worth preserving. 3,000 years of kings and farmers, of temples and floods, of mummies and markets and scribes in their school rooms, of prayers said at dawn and children falling asleep to the sound of the river. All of it cohering into something that felt, to those living inside it, like the natural order of the world. And perhaps it was. The Nile still flows north. The desert still glows gold in the evening light. The stars that watched over the pyramids being built still turn slowly overhead. The past is not as far as it sometimes feels. And so we come, gently, to the end of tonight's journey. We have moved through 3,000 years of civilization, from the first farmers pressing seeds into Nile silt to the last queen of a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for centuries. We have stood in the shade of temple columns and walked through the narrow lanes of a worker's village. We have listened to the scratching of reed pens on papyrus and the sound of harp music in the evening. We have looked at the face of a golden mask and read a grocery list written on a pottery shard 4,000 years ago. We have sat with the Egyptians' extraordinary faith in the persistence of things, their belief that love could survive death, that a name spoken aloud was a form of life, that the river flooding and receding each year was the universe keeping its promise. There is something quietly steadying about spending time with a civilization that lasted so long and left so much. It is a reminder that the things human beings care about most, family, home, the work of their hands, the beauty of the world around them, the hope of something beyond this life. These have not changed very much across all the centuries between them and us. The pyramids are still standing. The Nile still runs. The stars are still there above you now, the same ones that rose over the desert 3,000 years ago. It is enough. It is more than enough. Let your breathing slow a little more. Let whatever remains of the day release its hold. You have traveled far tonight, and you can rest now, carrying whatever small piece of the ancient world you found most interesting, most beautiful, or most human. Sleep well. Good night.